Hello, my name is Trace. I'm from the state of Kansas, within the United States. I would like to introduce to you this channel consisting of English with a subtitle.
The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck, 1892 to 1973. Chapter 8. It seemed as though once the gods turned against a man, they would not consider him again. The rains, which should have come in early summer, withheld themselves, and day after day the skies shone with fresh and careless brilliance. The parched and starving earth was nothing to them. From dawn to dawn there was not a cloud, and at night the stars hung out of the sky, golden and cruel in their beauty. The fields, although Wang long cultivated them desperately, dried and cracked, and the young wheat stalks which had sprung up courageously with the coming of the spring had prepared their heads for the grain. When they found nothing coming for them from the soil or the sky, ceased their growing and stood motionless at first under the sun, and at last dwindled and yellowed into a barren harvest. The young rice beds which Wang Long had sowed were squares of jade upon the brown earth. He carried water to them day after day, after he had given up the wheat, the heavy wooden bucket slung upon a bamboo pole across his shoulders. But though a furrow grew upon his flesh, and a callus formed there as large as a bowl, no rain came. At last the water in the pond dried into a cake of clay, and even the water in the well sunk so low that Olan said to him, "If the children must drink and the old man have his hot water, the plants must go dry." Wang Long answered with anger that broke into a sob, "Well, and they must all starve if the plants starve." It was true that all their lives depended upon the earth. Only the piece of land by the moat bore harvest, and this because at last, when summer wore away without rain, Wang Long abandoned all his other fields and stayed the day out at this one, dipping water from the moat to pour upon the greedy soil. This year, for the first time, he sold his grain as soon as it was harvested, and when he had the silver upon his palm, he gripped it hard in defiance. He would, he told himself, in spite of gods and drought, do that which he had determined. His body had broken, and his sweat he had spilled for this handful of silver, and he would do what he would with it. And he hurried to the house of Wang, and he met the land agent there, and he said without ceremony, "I have that with which to buy the land adjoining mine by the moat." Now Wang Long had heard here and there that for the house of Wang it had been a year verging upon poverty. The old lady had not had her dole of opium to the full for many days, and she was like an old tigress in her hunger, so that each day she sent for the agent, and she cursed him and struck his face with her fan, screaming at him, "And are there not acres of land left yet?" And as if this were not enough, the old lord took yet another concubine, a slave who was the child of a slave. This child of a slave, who was not more than 16, he now saw with fresh lust, for as he grew old and infirm and heavy with flesh, he seemed to desire more and more women. As the old mistress with her opium, so he with his lusts, and there was no making him understand. There was not money for jade earrings for his favorites, for gold for their pretty hands. He could not comprehend the words "no money," who all his life had but to reach out his hand and fill it as often as he would. And seeing their parents thus, the young lord shrugged their shoulders and said there must still be enough for their lifetime. They united in only one thing, and this was to berate the agent for his ill management of the estates. Neither had heaven sent rain upon the fields of the house of Wang, and there too there were no harvests. And so when Wang Long came to the agent crying, "I have silver," it was as though one came saying to the hungry, "I have food." The agent grasped at it, and the money passed from one hand to the other, and papers were signed and sealed, and the land was Wang Long's. He bought with it the desire of his heart. He had now a vast field of good land, for the new field was twice as large as the first. But more to him than its dark fertility was the fact that it had belonged once to the family of a prince, and this time he told no one, not even Olan, what he had done. Month passed into month, and still no rain fell. As autumn approached, the clouds gathered unwillingly in the sky, small light clouds, and in the village street one could see men standing about, idle and anxious, their faces upturned to the sky, judging closely of this cloud and that, discussing together as to whether they held rain in it. But before sufficient cloud could gather for promise, a bitter wind rose out of the northwest, the acrid wind of the distant desert, and blew the clouds from the sky as one gathers dust from the floor with a broom. And the sky was empty and barren, and the stately sun rose each morning and made its march and set solitary each night, and the moon in its time shone like a lesser sun for clearness. From his fields Wang Long reaped a scanty harvest of hardy beans, and from his cornfield, which he had planted in despair, when the rice beds had yellowed and died before ever plants had been set into the watered field, he plucked short stubby ears with the grains scattered here and there. There was not a bean lost in the threshing. He set the two little boys to sifting the dust of the threshing floor between their fingers after he and the woman had flailed the bean vines, and he shelled the corn upon the floor in the middle room, watching sharply every grain that flew wide. When he would have put the cobs away for fuel, his wife spoke out, "No, do not waste them in burning. I remember when I was a child in Shantung, when years like this came, even the cobs we ground and ate. It is better than grass." When she had spoken, they all fell silent, even the children. There was foreboding in these strange, brilliant days when the land was failing them. Only the girl child knew no fear. For her there were the mother's two great breasts, as yet filled for her needs. But Olan, giving her suck, muttered, "Eat, poor fool, eat, while there is yet that which can be eaten." And then, as though there were not enough evil, Olan was again with child, and her milk dried up, and the frightened house was filled with the sound of a child continually crying for food. If one had asked Wang Long, "And how are you fed through the autumn?" he would have answered, "I do not know, a little food here and there." But there was none to ask him that, none asked of any other in the whole countryside. "How are you fed?" None asked anything except of himself. "How shall I be fed this day?" And parents said, "How shall we be fed, we and our children?" Now Wang Long's ox had cared for as long as he could. He had given the beast a bit of straw and a handful of vines as long as these lasted, and then he had gone out and torn leaves from the trees for it until winter came and these were gone. Then, since there was no land to plow, since seed, if it were planted, only dried in the earth, and since they had eaten all their seed, he turned the ox out to hunt for itself, sending the eldest boy to sit upon its back all day and hold the rope passed through its nostrils so that it would not be stolen. But latterly he had not dared even to do this, lest men from the village, even his neighbors, might overcome the lad and seize the ox for food and kill it. So he kept the ox on the threshold until it grew lean as its skeleton. But there came a day when there was no rice left and no wheat left, and there were only a few beans and a meager store of corn, and the ox lowed with its hunger, and the old man said, "We will eat the ox next." Then Wang Lung cried out, for it was to him as though one said, "We will eat a man next." The ox was his companion in the fields, and he had walked behind and praised it and cursed it as his mood was, and from his youth he had known the beast when they had bought it a small calf. And he said, "How can we eat the ox? How shall we plow again?" But the old man answered tranquil enough, "Well, and it is your life or the beast's, and your son's life or the beast's, and a man can buy an ox again more easily than his own life." But Wang Long would not that day kill it. And the next day passed, and the next, and the children cried out for food, and they would not be comforted, and Olan looked at Wang Long, beseeching him for the children, and he saw at last the thing had to be done. So he said roughly, "Let it be killed then, but I cannot do it." He went into the room where he slept, and he laid himself upon the bed, and he wrapped the quilt about his head, that he might not hear the beast bellowing when it died. Then Olan crept out. She took a great iron knife she had in the kitchen, and she cut a great gash in the beast's neck, and thus she severed its life. And she took a bowl and caught its blood to cook for them to eat in a pudding, and she skinned and hacked to pieces the great carcass. And Wang Lung would not come out until the thing was wholly done, and the flesh was cooked and upon the table. But when he tried to eat the flesh of his ox, he could not swallow it, and he drank only a little of the soup. And Olan said to him, "An ox is but an ox, and this one grew old. Eat, for there will be another one day, and far better than this one." Wang Long was a little comforted then, and he ate a morsel and then more, and they all ate. But the ox was eaten at last, and the bones cracked for the marrow, and it was all too quickly gone, and there was nothing left of it except the skin, dried and hard, and stretched upon the rack of bamboo Olan had made to hold it spread. At first there had been hostility in the village against Wang Long, because it was supposed that he had silver which he was hiding and food stored away. His uncle, who was among the first to be hungry, came importuning to his door, and indeed the man and his wife and 7 children had nothing to eat. Wang Long measured unwillingly into the skirt of his uncle's robe a small heap of beans and a precious handful of corn. Then he said with firmness, "It is all I can spare, and I have first my old father to consider, even if I had no children." When his uncle came again, Wang Long cried out, "Even filial piety will not feed my house," and he sent his uncle empty away. From that day his uncle turned against him like a dog that has been kicked, and he whispered about the village, in this house and in that, "My nephew there, he has silver and he has food, but he will give none of it to us, not even to me and to my children, who are his own bones and flesh. We can do nothing but starve." And as family after family finished its store in the small village and spent its last coin in the scanty markets of the town, and the winds of winter came down from the desert, cold as a knife of steel and dry and barren, the hearts of the villagers grew distraught with their own hunger and with the hunger of their pinched wives and crying children. And when Wang Long's uncle shivered about the streets like a lean dog and whispered from his famished lips, "There is one who has food. There is one whose children are fat," still the men took up poles and went one night to the house of Wang Long and beat upon the door. And when he had opened to the voices of his neighbors, they fell upon him and pushed him out of the doorway and threw out of the house his frightened children, and they fell upon every corner and they scrabbled every surface with their hands to find where he has hidden his food. Then when they found his wretched store of a few dried beans and a bowlful of dried corn, they gave a great howl of disappointment and despair, and they seized his bits of furniture, the table and the benches, and the old man lay frightened and weeping. Then Oland came forward and spoke, and her plain, slow voice rose above the men. Not that yet, she called out. It is not yet time to take our table and the benches and the bed from our house. You have all our food, but out of your own houses you have not sold yet your table and your benches. Leave us ours. We are even. We have not a bean or a grain of corn more than you. No, you have more than we now, for you have all of ours. Heaven will strike you if you take more. Now we will go out together and hunt for grass to eat and bark from the trees, you for your children and we for our 3 children and for this 4th who is to be born in such times. Pressed her hand to her belly as she spoke, and the men were ashamed before her, and went out one by one, for they were not evil men, except when they starved. One lingered, that one called Ching, a small, silent, yellow man with a face like an ape's in the best of times, and now hollowed and anxious. He would have spoken some good word of shame, for he was an honest man, and only his crying child had forced him to evil. But in his bosom was a handful of beans he had snatched when the store was found, and he was fearful lest he must return them if he spoke at all. And so he only looked at Wang Long with haggard, speechless eyes, and he went out. Wang Long stood there in his yard, where year after year he had threshed his good harvest, and which had lain now for many months idle and useless. There was nothing left in the house to feed his father and his children, nothing to feed this woman of his, who besides the nourishment of her own body had this other one to feed into growth. This other one who would, with the cruelty of new and ardent life, steal from the very flesh and blood of its mother. He had an instant of extreme fear. Then into his blood like soothing wine flowed this comfort. He said in his heart, They cannot take the land from me, the labor of my body and the fruit of the fields I have put into that which cannot be taken away. If I had the silver, they would have taken it. If I had bought with the silver to store it, they would have taken it all. I have the land still, and it is mine.